Alan, it's interesting to look at this. I thought we were over lyrics with the whole Tipper Gore thing a few years ago, but it just keeps coming back, doesn't it?
It does. The whole Time's Up, Me Too thing is forcing a lot of cultural things to be placed under the microscope. And we have a lot of people looking back on the way things were and viewing those things in through a lens of contemporary culture, contemporary mores, contemporary attitudes. And we saw this, of course, in the United States with the polarization over things like Confederate monuments. That's just one example. And another example is we're looking back at music and thinking, how did we ever listen to and like and dance to and sing along to some of these songs, considering what the lyrics were actually saying? And this is the topic of this sticky lyrics panel at the museum involving the Rolling Stones Unzipped exhibition.
Brown Sugar is obviously I guess the most, I don't want to call it extreme, but I'll call it extreme example from the Rolling Stones catalog. Is that fair?
It's certainly one of the most controversial. I mean, it really was from the very beginning, because we are talking about a slave girl down in New Orleans who, well, apparently exists for the pleasure of white men. It's a great song from in terms of the music and the groove and the feeling and the energy. But if you listen to the lyrics really carefully, it's like, Mick, where were you going with this? And what's your thoughts? So, back then, things were substantially different. Our standards were different. Let's just say that we weren't perhaps as enlightened as we are today. And now you look at that, you go, maybe we shouldn't be. We should probably take a really good look at what we're actually singing and along to, and reevaluate whether or not we should be doing that. Even the Rolling Stones have done it. They've looked at this and have gone, yeah, you know what? It may be one of our biggest songs, one of our biggest hits, but we're not going to play it live anymore because, well, we've seen the error of our ways.
The argument, of course, is that it's a moment in time. It reflects something there, and that by canceling that, if I can use that word, we're disrespecting the art.
I think so. I think the last thing that anyone needs to do is erase any kind of history, because if you erase it, you can't teach it. If you can't teach it, you will end up repeating it. This is just something that happens generationally, that people will remember the way things used to be. And the new generation will come along and go, well, how could you people be so insensitive and wrong? And they want all examples of that wrongness erased from culture and history. You can't do that. You really can't do that. With music, it's really difficult, because there are many songs, that are really problematic when you look at it in terms of today's societal and cultural standards. So what do you do with those songs? And that's the big question. Do you learn from them and say, wow, look how far we've come and how much we've evolved? Or do you say, well, these songs need to be, segregated and put into the bad box, like a lot of the songs that came out in the early 1900s, which are, blatantly racist, and we would never think of listening to them again. But I mean, it's an apples and oranges situation, because we wouldn't listen to those songs because of the bad recordings, the bad performances, and all that sort of stuff. So what do you do with a song like Some Girls? What do you do with a song like Brown Sugar? What do you do with a song like even Under My Thumb? If you listen to the lyrics of that one, it's a bit cringy. So this is a discussion that's going to continue for quite some time, because a lot of these songs are really, really deeply ingrained into culture, and they are some of the greatest hits of all time. So what do you do? And then I'm not sure what the answer is.
Yeah, the answer is difficult to find, and I wonder if we go back to the artist to find that out. We're lucky in that we still have Mick Jagger around. I wonder what his perspective is. What, 60 years after he wrote it? How does he look at that, I wonder?
I don't know. Again, they've stopped playing the song live, which, by the way, created a backlash amongst fans saying, look, we know what the song was about, but we still like it. And we don't take what you're saying seriously. We understand that maybe Mick, you were singing from the perspective of a character, or you were singing about, the guy you were in 1972, or whatever the situation is. These artists are having to reckon with their past behavior. And the lyrics thing is just a jumping off point, because if you start questioning these lyrics, then you start looking a little deeper into the lifestyles of these artists back, during that sex, drugs, and rock and roll time. And you run across things like Jimmy Page going on tour with his 14-year-old mistress. You hear stories about David Bowie and underage women. It's where does it stop? Because once you pick the scab on the idea of sexism and exploitation in rock and roll, then you are going down a very deep rabbit hole, and it expands out from rock and roll into pop. It expands out later into hip hop, and every single genre. So, societal evolution is a slow, ponderous thing, and after 50 years, we look back and go, "Ooh, geez." Maybe the question is, what do we do going forward?
Well, so much of songs, whether they're written today or written 50 years ago or 60 years ago or 100 years ago, are about relationships, and relationships are problematic. And I just, what are we left with if we take those songs away, right? What are we left with?
Yeah, they're about relationships. They're about tension in relationships. They're about sexual energy in relationships. Yeah, you start looking at some of these songs and you go, okay, we're not left with a whole lot. Not just by expunging these songs from our past, but all right, what do I write about as a contemporary artist going forward if I can't write about these things? And it does. I'm not defending this in any way, shape, or form, but it does create pause on the side of composers who are now, not only are they worried about writing a song that contains a riff or a melody line that has been used by someone in the past, so they can be sued for plagiarism, but there are other, contemporary sort of situations like the Robin Thicke Blurred Lines, which is probably the most rapey song that we've heard in the last 10 years. That was a huge hit, but then there was a backlash against it. And now people are going, I don't need that in my career. So I'm going to maybe move off and write about other things.
What's interesting to me about this is it really, in a lot of ways, isn't new. It's reversed at this point, because your parents probably told you to turn down the noise. My parents told me. Mozart's parents probably didn't like the music that he was playing either. But this is completely reversed. We've changed the looking glass around in a very, very, very different way. But
Yeah,
it's
that's a really good point. It's the kids looking at mom and dad going, your songs were terrible. Your acts were sexist. Your acts were racist. Your acts were all these things. And the parents will just throw their arms up and go, look, it was the time. It was okay at the time. I'm not saying it's okay to do this today, but you have to look at things in terms of historical context, because if you don't, you won't learn anything from it. You won't understand why things were the way they were and why things are the way they are today. And the Rolling Stones actually made a big career out of being these bad boys of rock and roll. There was a very famous or infamous billboard that was put up on the Sunset Strip. And at one time, the Sunset Strip had all these billboards. It was famous for all these billboards that advertised albums that were coming out. And they had one for their Black and Blue album. And it was a woman smiling who was black and blue. Apparently she'd been beaten up with her hands tied above her head and a big smile on her face. That was a billboard on Sunset Boulevard. You would never, ever, ever see anything like that today. And, for obvious good reason. But, so it's again, you can't erase history. You got to go back and look at it, try to understand it, learn from it, and then make sure you don't repeat it.
And rock and roll, and I guess all popular music, it's supposed to upset the apple cart, right? It's supposed to push the envelope. If you take that away, I don't know what's left.
Yeah, it's getting more and more difficult to shock. I mean, after 70 plus years of rock and roll, a lot of the shock has gone out of it. I think we probably reached peak shock in the 1990s. That's my, just off the top of my head recollection. Things have settled down since then. As we become, again, I hate to use this word, but I can't think of another one, more enlightened, and certainly more afraid of being called out. But I mean, where do we go? I mean, there in the 90s we had acts like Marilyn Manson. We had acts like NWA, who were singing and rapping about things that really made people very, very uncomfortable. And in some cases they were done provocative, to create discussion. In other cases they were just being provocative and designed to shock. So how do we shock people going forward when all the tropes have been pretty much mined, and you can't be sexist? Well, I suppose you could go ahead and be sexist and racist as you want, but the pushback you're going to get today versus 50 years ago is exponentially higher. And nobody wants to go down that road, because that's a sure sign, unless you want to be like a niche act that appeals to Nazis. You're not going to have much of a career.